It is now my pleasure to introduce Tim Wyatt, who is going to be our next speaker. Tim is an esoteric writer and publisher, and he also an international lecturer for the Theosophical Society and other organizations. He is a member of the TS board in London, editor of Esoterica magazine, and events organizer for Leeds Lodge. The title of his talk, Imaging the World, a New World, Mind Healing for a Wonderful Planet. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and any genders I may have omitted this afternoon. I'd like to start with something which is completely irrelevant to this lecture. The other day I was on the phone to Gary Kidgel. He's the very handsome gentleman up on the 7th row in the striped shirt there. He told me this wonderful story. A theosophist dies and finds himself in the afterlife. They wander around for a while, exploring the different levels of the astral plane. Of course, there is no time in these inner dimensions. And eventually, he comes to two signs. The one to the left says Nirvana. The one to the right says lecture on Nirvana. I'll leave you to decide which direction the theosophist took. So the title of my talk is Imagining a New World, not imaging the world as maybe in your program there. I'd like to do my best with my limited capacities to inspire you this afternoon, if I can, and to energize you. I want to discuss what we might call the art of the achievable. And I'm issuing a kind of call to action. Because what I want you to do is to explore that magnificent apparatus that we all have, each and every one of us possesses, the mind, the mind. And let me remind you that mind is more than brain. The scientists tell us that the mind is just housed in this wet computer between our ears, but it's much, much more than that. So the prevailing view amongst the majority of people alive today is that the earth is a purely physical place made up of supposedly solid things called atoms. But of course, modern science and quantum physics now tells us that these things aren't solid at all. And so this idea of solidity is entirely illusory. But over the last 5 or 6 decades, increasing numbers of people have come to accept the idea that the Earth isn't simply a spherical lump of dead rock which orbits the sun every 365.25 days. Much more than that. It's a living, breathing, conscious entity. And we're all vibrant, active components of that. We're all part of the same thing. Barry alluded to this. Now, hard science still largely refutes these ideas and refuses to accept this deeply theosophical idea. This was actually put forward by a very interesting man, an independent scientist, someone who wasn't tied to the academic institutions, called James Lovelock, who died a few days ago at the ripe old age of 103. So he was obviously doing something right. And he came up with this idea of the Earth being a living, breathing thing back in the early 1970s with his Gaia theory. And essentially, he was one of the architects of the modern environmental and ecological movement. And few people these days, particularly when we look at the world around us, would deny how intimately interconnected are all the Earth's life forms, or indeed its physical infrastructure these days. Nevertheless, many people still hold on to this highly restricted view that all you see is all there is. The idea that the world is as alive as human beings or animals or flowers still remains an alien concept to them. Now, why is this? Well, it's the result of a mechanistic and exclusively material perception of ourselves and everything else around us. As we're all very aware in this room today, the ageless wisdom tradition and theosophy has always taught the precise opposite of this narrow viewpoint. As theosophists, we don't only accept this view of the world as a living organism, we're also aware of the fact that just like us as human beings, the Earth also has a number of subtle bodies as well. It has an etheric body, and which conducts an energizing principle, conducting the life force through the invisible arteries and channels, just in precisely the same way as it does with each of us. And just like every one of us, our planet also has an astral body. And as we know, the astral world is a parallel mirror image of the physical. You could say that the astral world is where the templates or the blueprints for the physical form are first produced. And of course, beyond the etheric and beyond the astral are the mental and the spiritual worlds. The esoteric teachings tell us that the universe is essentially a realm of consciousness and spirit. It's not so much a big place, but as someone observed, it's a big thought, not a place, but a thought. But unknown to the vast majority of people, our Earth has this mental body. And this is where, in many ways, the physical world begins its journey to materialization. And each and every one of us on this planet, consciously or unconsciously, contributes to and constructs that collective mental body. So all creation, we might call it resurrection, begins on these elevated planes of existence of mind and spirit. So before we can create anything at all, we first have to imagine it. And we'll explore this idea in a little more detail in a few moments. But here we encounter a bit of a problem. Why? Because we don't understand what mind is. And science shies away from trying to define mind or consciousness, because science is still very much a materialistic venture. Not exclusively, and it is changing, but it does remain predominantly materialistic. And nor do we realize the huge importance or the creative potential of thought. This is an incredibly powerful thing, and it's the most powerful weapon that we have, most powerful faculty that we have. Now, original thought is a very rare and exotic commodity. It should be prized and cherished, but more often than not, it's trashed or ignored or ridiculed. And here we have the history of the ages. It's gone on millennia after millennia. Why is this? Well, it's because new ideas often frighten people, don't they? And so do new ways of stating old ideas as well. So these ideas are often resisted, sometimes very violently. And there are sinister and dark forces at work on this planet, both exoteric and esoteric, who employ this fear and this doubt to impede human progress. These malign forces, as many of you will have read in the theosophical literature, they despise and want to oppose evolutionary advancement and always want to maintain a kind of stasis and a status quo. And these are effectively the guardians and the enforcers of materialism. Despite implacable opposition, however, many original thoughts and new ideas do smash through these barriers eventually, but often it takes quite a lot of time. Let's ask a question. How many people have even one original idea in their lives? How many? Very, very few people. Most people simply copy and then regurgitate the ideas of other people and their opinions, which have been originated by others. And usually they adopt these opinions because they imagine these other people are more knowledgeable or powerful than they are. They don't feel they have the right to express new opinions. Sadly, a lot of people are quite proud about never having to think for themselves, because why? Thinking requires effort. And thinking can be a very dangerous thing, particularly not just in the modern world, but throughout history as well. And yet mind is the supreme creative power. Minds are what make human beings unique. And if we consult the ancient teachings, we find that it was no easy task for our progenitors to furnish us with this faculty of mind in the distant past. They had to bring in outside people, those lords of the flame from Venus, because all other attempts to do this and put mind into human beings had failed. So we should attempt to elevate the mind and all its stupendous powers to a status far higher than we ever imagined before. By definition, having an esoteric perspective on the world necessitates a high degree of free thought and free expression. It also requires a degree of nonconformity. Freedom of thought is absolutely central and crucial to theosophy. It's repeated inside the front cover of every edition of the Theosophist and on our websites. In fact, this particular talk first started its life as an article in the Theosophist some years ago. Freedom of thought isn't only a precious thing, it's absolutely vital for human evolution and for civilization. Perhaps this is why throughout human history, there have always been those determined to oppose it at all costs, whether for political, religious, or other reasons. And it really pains me to say this. It really pains me to say this, but never before in my lifetime have freedom of thought and freedom of expression faced such mighty threats as they do today. And for once, this is not just by dictators or despotic regimes or religious fanatics, but from within our midst. And I'm talking here about something that gets talked about a lot these days, cancel culture. Cancel culture. It's reached pandemic proportions. And the people who are doing this are a tiny minority hell-bent on shaping humanity into some kind of homogenized, unthinking, corporate body of conformity. And this, as Theosophists, we must resist. We live in dangerously censorious times when a supposedly wrong thought or wrong expression can get you sacked from your job and ruin your reputation. Today, this is the work not of the majority, but tiny, zealous pockets of intolerance, intent on shutting down debate and free expression, and who label everything which doesn't mirror their echo chamber as hate speech. Now, certainly in the Anglosphere, the UK, America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and in other parts of Europe, many of our academic institutions have gone from places of innovation and open debate to forcing houses of conformity and indoctrination. Cancel culture is rife in these institutions, including this one. Some of these institutions now seem about as open-minded as a medieval monastery. I regard myself as extremely fortunate, as never having had much association with these places, probably because I'm too stupid, but there we are. Now, the occult perspective, as I said earlier on, is usually diametrically opposed to the conventional or prevailing wisdom as presented by science, religion, or politics. And even a cursory glance at history shows you that the prevailing wisdom of any period of history usually turns out to be wrong or flawed or incomplete. Now, in the past, indulging in dangerously radical explanations of oneself or the cosmos could get you killed. Look at Giordano Bruno or Socrates, or the thousands who perished during the various bloodlusts of the Catholic Inquisition, or in Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany. These days, free speech can still earn you a death sentence at the hands of primitive religionists or political fanatics. Engaging in freedom of expression can also see you punished in many other ways as well. Even the jails of some so-called Western democracies incarcerate those with undesirable words or opinions, or people who wanted to tell the truth. Look at Julian Assange. At no time in human history has a need ever been greater for fresh ways of thinking which stretch the human imagination beyond the confines of the physical world. Only new thought, new ideas can get us out of the mess that we're now in. As most of you here are aware, our thoughts directly create the world we live in. Thoughts are the invisible building blocks of the physical world. And if you look more closely at this highly defective world that we've produced, it precisely mirrors the mass myriad thought forms employed in their creation. Now, this whole mindset has been based upon this exclusively materialistic paradigm and worldview, which I alluded to earlier on. And what does materialism produce? It produces a world of ownership, of division, of conflict and inequality, in which the participants and the adherents will go to any length to ascend that greasy pole of power, which gives them wealth and influence and supposed success. And these are very unwholesome values. So this view goes something like this. There's nothing beyond the physical. If I can't see it, touch it, taste it, feel it, smell it, and test it to destruction in some atom smasher or a test tube, then it simply doesn't exist. End of story. This is tunnel vision. Anything else, say the materialists, is just imagination. Let's think about that phrase, just imagination, as if imagination were just another optional extra to bolt onto our everyday consciousness, as if it had no vitality and could just be condemned as idle daydreaming or wishful fantasy, as if imagination weren't the most powerful tool that we possess. Imagination is the biggest challenge and the biggest threat to the material world. It's also our best ally and asset in overturning that predominant view. We've imagined this world, and now we urgently need to imagine an alternative. If we can remake it with the mindsets and thought processes we employ to create our present environment, then nothing at all will change. We'll have another plundered and impoverished planet based on a fetish for wealth, greed, self-interest, fame, bigotry, human and planetary exploitation, and mass control by tiny elites. Now, you don't need me to tell you that the world is in crisis, politically, environmentally, financially, socially, and above all, morally. There are people who complain that we needlessly spend money on such things as the James Webb Telescope, which was launched quite recently, cost £10 billion. And yet it's, in its first few weeks of operation, has been able to see further back in time, further into the universe than ever before. And this is helping to understand our origins and our purpose. And this is what imagination can achieve. Now, some people claim that this is a waste of money and we should be using these resources to achieve better ends, but do we? No. Countries around the world annually spend around $2 trillion on armaments and defense and military activities. Just to remind you what $2 trillion is, that's 2,000 billion dollars. I'm old enough to remember when $1 billion was a lot of money. That would buy you, that annual military spend would buy you 200 James Webb telescopes. And then there's all that frivolous spending by billionaires who send themselves into space or build the biggest yachts that they've ever built. Jeff Bezos has just built a yacht which was so big they couldn't get it out of the harbor. The Dutch apparently threatened to throw rotten eggs at it. We've also got other concerns, sinister, outdated institutions, these dubious cabals of elites and rogue politicians backed by a conformist mainstream media, which seems intent on creating some kind of world that makes George Orwell's 1984 look like a vicar's tea party. This new world needs to be mentally reconstructed from the deepest subterranean depths and the very highest realms of our imaginations. And for this to happen, our imaginations need to be unshackled from their bonds, paroled from their self-imposed prisons, and let free to roam unhindered along the highways and byways of the earth and beyond. And this is a deeply spiritual endeavor. We need new ideas, new thoughts, and new intentions for this world. We need originality, not just another restricted cut and paste solution, the sort of thing that you hear the politicians talking about. When did you last find a politician with an original idea? Everything we do needs to be underpinned by the notion that we're spiritual beings undergoing a human experience, not the opposite. For any of this to succeed, we have to achieve a kind of critical mass so that these new ideas can explode into the world with all the power of a split atom. We can all play a part in this. Does this mean then that the majority of humanity have to first embrace these ideas themselves? Well, what Teresa had to say earlier on was very interesting, because she was talking about very tiny numbers, 15% or even 1% of the population. It might even be smaller than this, as we'll see. So you don't need the majority to do all this, because had that been the case, then the ideas of a few brave and usually persecuted individuals down the ages would never have taken hold. So initially, at least, change emerges from individuals and small groups. And this is why some of the shrill woke minorities have been able to so successfully in recent times subvert general thought and impose their own version of group think. But it does only take a surprisingly small proportion of any population to affect real and immediate change, either locally or globally. And it's always been that way. And this is the power of occult focus. There's an interesting idea emerging from the transcendental meditation movement, which emerged in the 1960s. And this asserts that it takes only the square root of 1% of any population to achieve significant positive change. And this has been seen where they tried this in a number of impoverished towns in Britain, which I covered many years ago as a journalist. Now, in November, the population of this earth will reach around about 8 billion people. 1% of that figure is 80 million. And the square root of that is around 9,000 people. That's all. It's the equivalent of a very small town. In this country, Britain, which has a little under 1% of the world's population, that would be around 80 people in the entire nation. 80 people is around the number of people that you could get on one of those red London double-decker buses. So it's not very many people at all. So closely focused with fresh ideas and suffused powerfully enough with a common aim, these 80 people could act as the vanguard in transforming this country economically, culturally, politically, socially, and environmentally. And they would succeed because they would be indulging in a major act of creative, non-personal white magic. Small numbers of people can have a hugely disproportionate effect. Military planners know this. They're aware that a handful of highly trained special forces can have a more destructive or strategic effect than an entire battalion of conventional soldiers if they're deployed in the right way, i.e. with originality and with imagination. Now, worldwide, the Theosophical Society has far greater membership than 9,000 people. Acting collectively, acting in tandem, with purpose, with imagination, with morality, and with focused intent, we can begin to create a better world right away. If we choose to do so, we could become the human dynamo. Theosophy, in its own quiet and unobtrusive way, has already had a massive influence on world affairs. It's reshaped world thought by introducing ideas and concepts which were alien when this society was formed almost 150 years ago. So, without overdoing the military analogies, this is a spiritual war. And those of us who wish to remake this world are its warriors. Our sole weapon is our imagination. Without vision, without inspiration, we can reconstruct nothing, because it all starts in the mind. Thank you.
On behalf of you all, I would like to thank Tim for his very thought-provoking talk.